So today we are going to listen to Sugar Le Fae, also known as Zach Matteson, who is one of our own, a prize-winning poet, translator, teacher, photographer, songwriter, and a radical fairy. His poems, essays, and interviews have appeared in numerous literary journals in Canada and the US. Currently, Sugar is pursuing his PhD at the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. His research focuses on queer topics, in particular the radical fairies, which is a social spiritual movement that advocates for radical empathy, including radical self-acceptance, communal living, and non-binary gender expression. Sugar is an avid, rabid, insatiable feminist and recognizes that homophobia and transphobia are in fact manifestations of misogyny. He believes that all of us, everyone in this room and everyone else, must learn to celebrate the feminine genuinely without objectification or irony. Each of us is an amalgam of masculine and feminine, and we should never be ashamed of ourselves. What a beautiful message.
To Flavius. Flavius, you like to tell Catullus all about your lovers. Can't keep quiet if they aren't ugly or awkward, so I can't imagine the hot little whore you're ashamed to admit to. Your muffled bed, fragrant still with garlands and Syrian oil, shouts out loud that you don't spend your nights alone, not to mention your mattress, dented here and there, the creaking and squeaking of your rickety bed frame. But why? What could possibly silence your indiscretions? Nothing. You don't stretch your fucked up hip unless you've been messing around. So tell me who you've had, Flavius, the good and the bad. I want to shout your fuckery to the sky in pretty poetry. Woo! Thank you. All right, welcome. I am Sugar Le Fae. This is To Shout Your Fuckery to the Sky in Pretty Poetry, Brothers, Lovers, and Other Men of Gaius Valerius Catullus. I wanted to start you off with a quote about translation. We're going to be talking about poetry and poetry translations, the difficulties of that, difficulties of translation in general, and then absolutely the difficulties of translating poetry. Is it ethically more appropriate for a translator to call attention through register, cadence, and the like to the passage of time and difference of cultural context? Or, when push comes to translational shove, is it ultimately more honest to create an illusion of immediacy to account for the way a story or poem might have been heard by its original audience? Oftentimes, when we read translation, and especially poetry translation, and especially if there is a large distance of time that has in between the translator and the original author, you do have a sense of a sort of antiquated language or an old-timiness that gets used to let us all know, I guess, that it was written a long time ago, because that's how they would have thought in English back in the day, obviously. It's kind of a fallacy to believe that you can actually make your audience understand a sort of length of time by simply having an old-timey quality about your translations, and I think it actually does a disservice to the author. Today we're talking about Gaius Valerius Catullus. It actually isn't a picture of him. There's no surviving portraits of Catullus. That is actually a Roman fresco, and I just thought he was really cute. So we can pretend that this is what Catullus probably looks something very similar to this, much more to this than to this. But I actually realized I kind of looked like a weird emo Jesus. So this is Gaius Valerius Catullus. He was a pretty amazing figure. He lived in around 84 BC is when he was born to 54 BC. He only lived to be about 30 years old. We don't know exactly when he died or why, but that's generally the consensus. He was born in Verona, which was then a province of Rome. And he was born to a prominent equestrian family, which meant that he hobnobbed with a lot of the wealthy and the rich and famous. His father was really good friends with Julius Caesar, and he was, I say contemporaries, really his father was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, and Marcus Cicero, who didn't like him at all. And he wrote many nasty, delightful poems, both to Caesar and to Cicero, and some of which we'll get into in a little bit. One of the most important Latin neoteric poets. Neoteric was a term that came out of a much earlier tradition in Greece, where poets started to turn away from the traditional subjects of poetry, which had been, if we think back to the tradition of Homer and all the ancient Greek poets, the sort of long epic poems about war and religion, the gods, and sort of heroic deeds. And they were really long, bloated, ridiculous stories. And there were these Greek pioneers about 200 years, 300 years before Catullus, who started to write about their own lives. They started to write about short, lyric, intimate poems. And they were called the neoteric, which just meant modernist poets. And the word got transferred over into Rome as well. And so Cicero in particular was obsessed with many poets that we could kind of loosely label as neoteric Greek poets, including Sappho, which we'll talk about in a little bit, who was maybe the most famous of this kind of style of poetry, and Telemachus, among others. He rejected the standard social and literary conventions of his day, but not entirely. He did write in very strict meters, but he just didn't write in the traditional meters in the traditional ways, and he definitely did not write about the traditional topics, as you will find out. So Catullus was a great admirer of the Greek poet Sappho, as I mentioned. She lived some 500, 600 years before him. And like Sappho, Catullus wrote short, intimate portraits of his friends and lovers, including erotic poems to both sexes. He models a lot of his career and his ideas about poetry on Sappho. Sappho was a poet who lived on the island of Lesbos around 630 BC, yeah. And she also, again, was quite famous for writing these short, intimate lyric poems to her friends. She supposedly had a girls' school there, although that's probably apocryphal. But she wrote all of these wonderful, really intimate, lovely, sexy poems to both men and women. Catullus translated some of them into Latin, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he's famous for his vulgar language, which I did try to replicate. As I think one should. He's also, on that note, he's oftentimes not translated very well. And that was another reason that I was really attracted to this project of translating him, because scholars are really scared to translate him in any other way that's not a total euphemism. So they take all of this stuff where he's using the kind of language that we would probably use with each other in private company, and which I don't think most of us would think is shameful at all, but when it's in a poem and it's there looking at you and it's its own little autonomous thing on the page, it can be sort of scary if there's all these four-letter words. So oftentimes what would happen is they would mistranslate it, or they would find these really kooky kind of euphemisms for what he was trying to say, or just blatantly mistranslate them altogether. He often gives his subjects clever pseudonyms to disguise and to mythologize them. He's very aware of the ways in which poetry is ephemeral, in the sense of both it being a short span, especially the kinds of poems that he wrote, a short moment, but also the idea of whether or not people are going to remember who you are. And he was really, in some ways, very consciously mythologizing his own story and these characters who were in his life. He wrote about his own life as far as we can tell. Of course, as any modern artist will tell you, there is always some distinction between the I in a piece of work and the writer themselves. And so we do know that Catullus certainly understood this artifice and mythologized both himself and his lovers in that way. And I'll point out when he's doing that. He wrote 116 surviving poems. He calls them Carmina, or single is Carmen. And the word is the Latin word for both song and poem. And so it's sort of interchangeably there. He wrote them in various meters, lengths, and tones, mostly to men. Most of them are written in sort of epistolary styles, like letters. He's most famous for his songs to a woman that he calls Lesbia in his poems, who's the wife of a high-ranking official, and she's writing, he wrote her more than 24 poems. What's interesting about Lesbia in general is that we're pretty sure we know who she was. She was probably this woman named Claudia Metelli, who was the wife of a high-ranking official. According to Catullus' own poems, he falls in love with her and is this very sort of naive whirlwind kind of fashion, like we do, and was then shocked. One, he was, they were having an affair anyway, but then he was shocked to find out that she was sleeping with a whole bunch of other people as well. And so a great chunk of his poems actually are poems, in fact, to her lovers that he is very upset with them about. So that's a big part of his shtick. But what's also interesting about Lesbia, and why I'm really I'm interested, I think it's really important to talk about her and to mention her, is because she's really been the focus of most scholarship on Catullus as well. She's a much more heteronormative model. It's easier to sort of fit her into contemporary modes of thought and sexuality, the relationship between Lesbia and Catullus. But the truth is that because of that kind of modern transposition of mores and psychology and social awareness of these kinds of things, a lot of the poems that Catullus has written to men have been deemed sort of secondary or lesser than, or not as primary, not as important as the Lesbia poems. And in fact, the vast majority of his poems, as you can see, out of 116 are actually written to men. It's not to Lesbia. But it tends to be the case that scholars focus on the Lesbia poems, and then these other poems are sort of extra stuff that we don't really talk about too much. But obviously, people were enjoying them for many years. He was actually really well known for many, many generations after his death, but was eventually totally forgotten, and we only had references to him by other authors until the 14th century, when a single manuscript was found in Verona, which has now been lost. But it was pretty amazing to think Verona's hometown still had his book in the 14th century. And then, of course, in the Middle Ages, a lot of literate people were the monks that were living in these monasteries and things, and I'm sure they were getting a big kick out of Catullus. One of the only ones that could speak Latin anymore. So I'm sure that's also why he made it through. Anyway, I think I've got one more thing in here. Oh yeah, this is to give some context historically to Catullus' world. This is the extent of the Roman Empire, the orange. This just shows the expansion between 200 and 100 BC. So you can see that it goes all, in just 100 years, Rome expanded from the island, or from the peninsula of Italy all throughout the Mediterranean, and about 20 years later, Catullus is born into this, and at that point, they've actually already conquered most of the rest of Gaul as well. So you can understand that as the Roman Empire is getting larger and larger, it's becoming much more unstable. This is what we're still referring to as the Roman Republic, meaning that it was a republic in the same way that Canada and America are. There was representational government, there was a Senate, people were elected. But, as you can also imagine, as Rome became more and more powerful over the years, it was more easily corruptible, and all these officials all this money was coming in, and it was not being distributed equally. We had huge wealth inequality, which was happening, and for about 100 some years, there was nothing but political turmoil and strife, and people sort of taking over from each other, and so on and so forth. Catullus would have been alive and had a memory, about 10 years old, of the Spartan slave revolt. So we can definitely understand that his world was very, very tumultuous. He would have actually known gang violence in Rome. It was a time right before when Julius Caesar declares civil war, crosses the Rubicon with his standing army, which happens shortly after Catullus dies, actually. But it's leading up to this kind of stuff, which is going to give us sort of some insight into the context of where Catullus is writing. And it's really important to note these things because, in particular, Catullus's idea of autonomy, that one should have and celebrate autonomy and write it in poetry, is pretty revolutionary. It's now something that we sort of accept as a part of the artist's milieu, is that you have a certain autonomy that you are struggling to maintain against the oppressive society. But it really wasn't a commonplace idea until people like Catullus really fought to maintain a kind of art which focuses on the individual, which celebrates autonomy and celebrates individual freedom. So it's really important to understand what he's reacting to. and why this is so important to him. You can also see why all this money, most of the poetry that's been written right now is being paid for by these generals and things, and it's just this epic garbage, right? About how awesome we all are and how we're the best and Rome, Rome, Rome. So Catullus is, he doesn't take political office, which was expected of him. I should also mention he came from a well-to-do equestrian family. He was absolutely expected to take political office, and it was kind of assumed that he would just rise up into the ranks and be a sort of rich, wealthy Roman like everybody else. But instead, he chose to serve what he calls, or serve otium, which is the Latin word for leisure, but it had a much bigger idea than just leisure. It was a particular kind of leisure that one took in order to perform art or into study or to focus on something. And there's all these kind of sort of jokes in Roman society about how senators will eventually just retire to otium and they'll just go back to their villas and just leave everybody else because they can't deal with it anymore. So they just retire from public life and they just sit in their study and are in otium all the time. Well, Catullus was wealthy enough because of his family that he could have a lot of otium, and he spent it writing a lot of poems, but he also realizes and acknowledges the danger that's there. Let me see if I have one more quote or not. Oh yeah, I do. Okay, cool. So in general, something to be thinking about, we're going to go into several of his poems, and I'll give you little tidbits in between, but just go ahead and bookmark your questions for the end, and then we can hopefully talk more specifically about process and like any particulars that you're interested in during the question and answer period, so I don't take up a huge amount of your time. Catullus's poems in general, though, they celebrate autonomy and compression, so they're all short, within 20 lines about, and celebrate autonomy, both personal freedom autonomy of the speaker, but also the autonomy of the poem. The poem, the singular poem, should be able to create a world of its own and be understood within its own world. That again becomes an idea that we take for commonplace now, and certainly after the advent of people like Shakespeare, this idea of like writing individual poems for your lover doesn't seem that strange at all. It really was not common in Rome, and was one of the first times that we see it in history. He likes to also engage in misdirection, which is again something that wasn't quite common in the way that he was doing it, because he engages in sort of misdirection based on your own personal social mores, your understanding of them within Roman culture. So oftentimes he'll start a poem about one gender and it turns out to be about another gender. There's this kind of bisexual assumption that he can make, because there is a sort of bisexual assumption within Roman society at this time. And he employs sophisticated images and metaphors, which really sort of stand in for larger emotions. And he invokes conversational tones and contexts. So he's constantly talking about just stuff he's like doing with his buddies or his love affairs or things like that. And when he does get into the political, which he does, even then they come off sounding more almost like personal attacks than they do big schemes. So we're going to jump into some of his poems. This first one, you should know that, so for my dissertation, I decided that since all of these lesbian poems have been so thoroughly scholarized, I would focus on the men in Catullus's life and see if we could paint a portrait of his relationship with men and how he felt about it, and hopefully you can see for yourself. It's not really something that I have to sort of convince you of, I think, after you hear a lot of these poems. But for some reason, even if you go to Wikipedia, Catullus's sexuality is very, very minimized, and they talk, I mean, it's all about lesbian, and then, oh, well, he might have thought something about a friend or two, but the truth is that it's just not the case. So I'm going to start off with a song. He called them all songs. My personal translation aesthetic and priorities were to bring Catullus into a contemporary vernacular so that he's now understandable to us today. I didn't have any desire to make him sound old and antiquated. The stuff he's talking about isn't. It's totally relevant, and you just have to present it in a way which is going to bring out those elements naturally. Every translation is inherently an interpretation. And anybody that tells you otherwise is just trying to sell their personal translation. There is no one way to translate anything, and you have to just sort of assume that right off the go. So I definitely made certain decisions which not everybody would make in my translations, but we can talk about those later. So the first one is he is broken up with Lesbia, or he's breaking up with her, and yeah, we'll go from there. Song to leisure. He seems to me to be equal to a god. He, if it's possible, outshines the divine, who, sitting opposite you again and again, sees and listens to your sweet laughing. Miserable, it rips all sense from me, for when I look at you, Lesbia, nothing is left for me. My tongue is numb, and under my thin limbs a flame spreads. With their own sound my ears ring, my eyes' lights are shrouded by a twin night. Leisure, Catullus, is dangerous for you. With leisure, you jump and gesture too much. Leisure has destroyed kings before, and whole cities. I want to show you that home. So, Euphrosines Spensu, I just like this quote. Catullus invents a poetry of love and conscious separation from the old values. His rejection of traditional masculinity allows him to find new roles and to explore the different perspectives of the feminine. What you might notice in the last poem is that he takes on the role, in the very beginning, seemingly, of somebody who's eyeing a sexy young man, and then it turns out that he's really just upset that this man is looking at his woman. And even aside from that, just the fact that Catullus is willing to show himself as a vulnerable being is something that is really revolutionary already in this time and place. So what does any self-respecting, straight Roman citizen go out and do? Gets himself a hot young man. His woman broke up with him. Pickup line, Juventius. Juventius, if someone let me kiss your honey-sweet eyes continuously, I would kiss them without interruption 300,000 times and never be satisfied. Not even if the grit from my kisses grew thicker than dry stubble. Well, he finally made it to the kiss. I'm not sure if it was what he expected. Kissing Juventius. While you played, Juventius, honey, I stole a little kiss from you, sweet as the sweetest nectar. But I took it not without cost. For over an hour, I remember I was nailed to the top of a cross while I purged myself for you, unable, even with tears, to ease a scintilla of your severity. For as soon as it happened, you rinsed your lips clean with gobs of water with all your fingers, in case any contaminant from my mouth remained, like it's the filthy spit of some pissed-on bitch. What's worse, you never fail to hand me over miserable to septic love, or to excruciate me in all kinds of ways, so that for me that peck changed from nectar-flavored to bitter as the bitterest tincture. Since you levied this penalty on my pitiful love, I'll never again steal kisses after this. So, tried to go find a hot young twink. Didn't really work out so well. Catullus, man, he just doesn't have the best of luck. Should give you a little insight into what's happening. In Greco-Roman culture, there was a tight interconnection between gender, sexuality, and power. Sexual relations were seen in a pattern of dominance and submission, control and passivity, superiority and inferiority. Borrowing the classical Greek structures of Erastes and Eromenos, relationships were often understood as between lover and beloved, as the structure of the relationship slipped into Roman literature and social attitudes. Now, when we talk about Orestes and Romanos, it's also, yes, those do mean beloved, lover and beloved, but they also mean top and bottom. They were actually very specific. They were meant to be representations of the active participant in sex and the passive participant in sex. And so it's not, for example, in Rome and Greece before it, it wasn't so much that you would have been considered heterosexual or homosexual, it would have simply been that you were either a top or bottom, fundamentally. Some people can't be bottoms, can't be tops maybe. I don't know, it's complicated. But the point is that you could be a top, for example, and sleep with any gender if you wanted to. It didn't matter. And you were fundamentally still understood as a part of the patriarchy and the hierarchy in that way. And so what's also interesting about that is that love poems, therefore, are oftentimes, or love between men in literature and in art in Rome, is sort of limited because you are not allowed, if you are actively being the actor, the penetrator, to write a love poem to another penetrator. That would just be totally unfashionable and unseasonable and I don't know, all kinds of terrible things. And so you were quite limited, but then again, there was all of this difficulty parsing class and race and even gender, and so you oftentimes see these sort of put into these strict paradigms of top and bottom. What's interesting is that Catullus doesn't do that always. He writes poems to Juventius we can imagine as being a young man. Juventius actually means young man in Latin. It's a pseudonym. It means 20-year-old actually is what it technically means in Latin. So we can understand Juventius as being younger than him, probably being of a lesser social class than him. But Catullus also wrote love poems to men who were at the same level as him in society and who actually maybe were even higher up than him. And one of them is his friend Licinius Catullus. Oh shit, I didn't really have one. Before we get to Licinius though, actually, I forgot that after Catullus has this affair with Juventius, it's off and on, and he's constantly trying to figure out what's going on. But he's got all these other friends who are total horn dogs, and he's got to let them know, he's got to set the score of let them know that they can't mess with his boyfriend. Alright. Advisory. Aurelius. I'm entrusting myself and my lover to you, Aurelius. I'm here to ask a favor. If ever you wanted anything with your soul that you expected pure and unhandled, kindly protect my boyfriend from me. I don't have to ask everyone. I'm not scared of people on the street passing this way and that, minding their own business. Really, it's you I'm scared of, and your penis. Dangerous to good boys and bad. You shake it where and when it suits you as much as you want. When it's out, you're ready. For this one guy, I make, I think, a modest exception. But if your malignant brain and mad passion compel so much action, you asshole, that you lasso my boyfriend's head with snares, then a nasty fate for you, poor bastard, when with legs spread, radishes and spiny fish break your gaping door. What Catullus is referring to here is actually a practice in ancient Greece called rhaphanidosis, in which adulterers were sodomized with radishes. Not going to do that again. All right. Of course, it's also double entendre. You could just be talking about sort of throwing trash at somebody's door or something in the same way. But yeah, that's the idea.
What's the traditional translation of this stuff?
Bookmark it for the end, and we'll talk about that. So, gave this warning to Aurelius, didn't really go all that well either. So Aurelius and Furius were friends of his, and they were convinced that just because Catullus wrote about bad things in his poetry, he must be a bad person. So Catullus was pretty pissed off about that, and he decided to let them know what he thought. In Catullus' view, if everything he wrote happened in real life, then he might as well do terrible things to people in poems, and they couldn't do anything about it. To Aurelius and Furius. I'll pound your ass, Aurelius, you slut. And Furius, you cunt, I'll fuck your mouth. You think you know me because you've read my stuff? Conflate the poet and the speaker much? We agree that poets should be decent people, but their verses needn't be. In fact, most poems are worth their salt because they're sexy or lack decency. Poems that itch like stitched incisions. I speak not to twinks, who cares, but to bears, unable to maneuver their own hard loins. You who've read my kisses by the thousands dare to claim I'm not a man, that I'm the fag? I'll fuck you till you squeal, then I'll make you gag. But you also notice in this one, I did transfer this one into a sonnet because it was already 14 lines. It's not something that I generally actually like to do. I feel like there's a certain kind of colonialization of poetry translation where it's sort of the next generation just transfers everything into its particular aesthetic. But it was just kind of too, it was just begging for it. It's just a little too easy, I couldn't say no. Okay, so, well, that didn't go as expected. So I had to deal with Aurelius and Furious now, messing with his boyfriend and trying to tell him he's like a douchebag in his poems. And, but the truth is, you know, who's he kidding, really? He's actually falling for one of his best friends. To Licinius Catullus. Yesterday, Licinius, a leisurely day, we played around at my writing desk, since we'd agreed to be indulgent, scribbling verses, one then the other. We played around with this or that meter, reciting back and forth over jokes and wine. And I left there, ignited, Licinius, by your charisma and your sarcasms, so that no kibble satisfied me, miserable. No sleep covered my eyes in quiet, but wild with passion, I tossed and turned all over the bed, desiring daylight to speak to you again and be together. But after my limbs, half dead, exhausted from their labor, were tossed around my bed, tossed across my bed, I wrote this poem for you, my delight, so that you might understand my English. Remember now, whose prayers you spit on, darling. Lest Nemesis demand retribution from you. She's a fierce goddess. You'll remember hurting her. Nemesis should be known as the goddess of justice. It was typically actually used to invoke in war. It was used to invoke war poetry. The Hellenization of Roman society in the late Republic afforded Romans plenty of scope for their preferences, even if the traditional morality of Rome continued to condemn them. So Catullus can abuse his enemies as pathici or chinaide, but in another mood, he and Catullus can play at being delicati, which means the same without the pejorative overtones. The Juventius poems betray similar ambiguity. Catullus pretends that his readers will shrink from touching them, but he clearly expects them to go on reading. This was important because the words pathici and chinaide are two bad words in Latin. You can feel a little bad looking at them. Pathici means essentially, another word that's a cognate of it is passive. It just basically means taker. It means bottom. And chinaide means essentially male dancer that shook his butt a lot. So they were oftentimes used interchangeably to mean something equivalent to the word faggot. What's really interesting, and I did translate it that way in some of the poems, there is this inherent misogyny or homophobia that runs throughout Catullus's poetry, even though he openly talks about having sexual relationships with men and having sexual desire for men. And so that's interesting to note too, and I think we should be really careful not to be quick to call Catullus a gay poet, for example. I don't think he really was. I think in fact, he would have been considered a sort of, in his day, the version of a straight man, ultimately, because he wasn't judged for sleeping with men as long as he was in the active role. So, he had this sort of nice dream about Licinius Calvus. But the truth is he was still really angry at Lesbia and all those bastards that she slept with. And he wanted to let them know. Song to Gaius. Who can say, Gaius, why your rosy little lips go wider than winter's snow when you leave home in the morning, and when after a long day 2 p.m. stirs your cat nap? Who knows for sure whether the whispers are true that you devour the erect tents of men's laps? What's certain is the clamor of your pathetic John's busted nut, your lips stained with spilt milk. As you can see here, classic misdirection on Catullus's part. When you start reading the poem, you have no idea that it's going to be nasty. It sounds, and in fact, oftentimes what we think of as Victorian imagery, that's sort of the white face and the red lips, actually goes all the way back to Rome and Greece, in fact. So he's using that kind of sentimental, schlocky kind of language intentionally to then really get a shock after you at the end. We're going to skip those because we're going to short time. Yeah, skip this. So, he writes poems about male lovers and friends and enemies, and he also writes poems about his brother, who died. We don't really know exactly why, but he wasn't there, and he had to travel a long way to get there. Song to his brother. Carried through many countries and across many seas, I arrive, brother, at your miserable funeral, to give you death's last tribute and speak in vain to your mute ashes, since fate stole the real you from me. Fuck, my fucking brother, fucking taken from me. But anyhow, these, which in the old ways of our parents are handed down like sad prizes at a funeral, take them, wet with brotherly tears and snot and sweat. Now and forever, brother, goodbye and farewell. So, as I mentioned earlier, Catullus is really good friends with a lot of the famous contemporaries of the time. We know so much about this generation of people, it's kind of amazing, actually. And one of the most important and famous that he was acquainted with is Sir Julius Caesar, who I think the costume was supposed to be a Caesar costume, not a Jesus costume. You know, Caesar was scary. Caesar was scary. You know, he had a whole army that just adored him and would follow him all the way into Rome and commit civil war. So when you're writing poems about Caesar, you need to be careful of what you're talking about. Quip to Caesar. I'm not exceedingly eager to want to please you, Caesar, or know which one you are, fair, shady character. And here's the ballbuster. Imagine this is kind of a tack ad. And as I mentioned earlier, note the personal nature of it. To Julius Caesar. Does no one else see this? Who can stand it except a shameless, voracious player? that your man Memora gets all Gaul's woodland and Britain's furthest reaches? Roman gigolo, when will you wake up and own up? And now, overconfident and overflowing, he struts through everyone's beds like some off-white peacock or Adonis. Roman gigolo, when will you wake up and own up? You're the shameless, voracious player. Is this the reason, my lonely leader, you went to westernmost Britain? So this fucked up prick of yours could come a couple 100 times? What's that but a left-handed jack-off? Hasn't he come enough or gorged enough? First his father's wealth is squandered, then the spoils from Pontus, and afterwards, well, Spain's gold-flooded rivers no more. Now beware the wealth of Gaul and Britain. Why do you shelter this madman? What can he do but devour his greasy patrimony? Is he the reason, wealthiest of Rome? Caesar, Pompey, you destroyed us all. Alrighty, and in conclusion, I'm going to leave you with one more quote from Peter Cole, who's the guy I quoted in the very beginning. My goal is to write translations which don't merely pickle old things, but try to transform them into something new. So I keep this quote in the back of my mind. Good translation both makes and discovers sense. It is reasonable and coheres emotionally, but it also, and more importantly, engages the salient properties or qualities of the original in its artfulness. And in taking on the responsibility for another's work of art in a different language, for the particular pressure, pleasure, texture, tension, and tone of its constituent parts, the translator becomes more responsive to these same constituent qualities, and so accounts for them as live elements to preserve them through transformation, rather than salting or pickling them through superficial mimicry. Thank you guys so much for coming.